has one idea of what a word means, and the person who's listening has another idea. But at any rate, the words which we use are not always reflective of what we think. And sometimes that's because we don't know a word for what we think, even if we are thinking that thing, and we use the closest we can come to it. And sometimes it's because what the word we use has baggage with other people. And that baggage or nuance sometimes means more than the dictionary meaning of that word. Words have history, and with that history comes some baggage. And depending on what it is, it can obscure our ability to communicate. So I would like to explore with Charles Woodard, our guest today, some of the complications of that. And just for some of you who may not be familiar with him, can you just introduce yourself, Charles, to the rest of our panel here?
I'm retired from SDSU. I taught English there for 40 years. I taught writing, a variety of writing courses. My academic area of specialization was American Indian literature. And much of my philosophy of language and life comes from that emphasis. I value very much American Indian philosophies of language, their ideas about the word and how to use it well, how to speak and write to be heard and understood. And it goes against the grain, I think, in some ways, of what's happened in our world in recent years. I think that we're moving in the other direction to some extent. And so I think American Indian philosophies, language, and indeed life are important precautionaries, and they're very informative. So I don't know what else to be said. I do a lot of reading. I used to do a lot of lecturing, not so much anymore, especially these days. I have an especially bright son.
I knew that would happen. He's my father, by the way.
I have three children, actually. Brian is the middle child.
So you were talking about the other ones.
There's only one son. So.
Yeah.
Paul, you can speak. Paul, you can speak to that. You're a middle child, right? Is the middle child the premier child, you think, in your experience?
Yeah, we're usually kind of in the shadows, but we're the ones that make things happen.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Right.
The fulcrums. Well, we're going to get started here. And I guess the first question to get started is precision in language important? What would you say?
Well, I would say it's all important. We must say what we mean, and we must say it concisely so that we're clearly understood. And I think that that has to do with selection and omission. What we choose to say and what we choose not to say. I used to tell my writing students that all the time. Stay focused. Keep in mind the main thing you want to say here, and edit out that which may be interesting, but doesn't really pertain to what you're saying in this instance. And then, of course, avoid inflation, cliches, hackneyed expressions, and so forth, in order to be heard and understood.
I would,
I think you must strive to speak and write selectively and well. And there's a tendency, I think, to overwrite and overstate. And therein lies the problem. Because we have to contend with the fact that I think listening skills are diminishing. I think attention spans are diminishing. I think it has everything to do with the pace of life. That we're not taking time to listen. If we're in conversation, we might be more inclined to be thinking about what we're going to say and carefully hearing what the other person is saying. And, haste makes waste. I think, on the other hand, that you have to speak well. You have to speak memorably. You have to try to find words that will resonate, that will cut through the static and stay with the listener or the reader. I think a good example of that was something that now President Biden said last night in his inaugural address. And, his address contained some of the usual political rhetoric, a little less of it, and he was well spoken, he and whoever worked with him for the address. But some of what he said was repetitive. He said it in various ways throughout the speech. If I were a speechwriter, I would suggest more is less. Sometimes the more you say, the less you say. So he wouldn't have had to repeat some things as much as he did. But overall, I thought it was a commendable address because it was plain English. And there wasn't as much redundancy as one usually hears in a political speech. But an example of using words to effect and speaking memorably was when he said, well, we have to put an end to our uncivil war. I thought that was wonderfully expressed because, of course, we have this extremely ironic term, by the way, isn't it? Civil war, since war is the most uncivilized of human behaviors. But he took that well-worn term and turned it to something that was very memorable. We have to put an end to our uncivil war, he said. And those are the words that will remain with me. And some of the talking heads mentioned that too, that was an attention gainer. So you have to strive for that, I think. Again, very precise, very plainly stated, but memorable.
What part does the listener play in that precision? What responsibility does the listener have? As a general listener, if I'm going to be in civilization, speaking of being civil, I'm going to interact with others, and to some great extent, verbally, whether written or vocal. So what responsibility do I have as a listener, since communication is only 50% of the speaker and 50% the listener? At least that's my observation. What responsibility do I have to that precision? and how might I exercise that responsibility?
Well, if I understand the question, you first of all have the obligation to listen carefully, but more importantly, listening with an open mind, to be receptive to something you might not agree with or something you might not have considered before. I think you were talking before we started the program proper about what I think of as parallel conversations, which is a lot of the problem, I think, with our politics these days. People are speaking parallel to each other rather than to each other. And so you have, I think, a moral and ethical obligation to listen carefully with an open mind to whatever someone is saying to you, whatever someone has written that you're trying to comprehend. I really appreciated, I don't mean to make all this too political, but the recent events offer a lot of good opportunities to talk about language. I really appreciated what Mitt Romney said at the end of that awful night when they reconvened. And he was talking about what needed to be done from then on. And he said he didn't know that he thought that it was useful to establish the commission to again study the process of voting and the various systems involved. Because he said, and I'm roughly paraphrasing him, the outcome would be pretty predictable and people, again, wouldn't be hearing it because they'd been so conditioned to believe otherwise. It would be another instance of fake news. And he said, and I thought that this was especially important, he was speaking, I think, to his obligation as an elected official. Rather than that, he said, what we need to do is tell the truth. That's a quaint idea, isn't it? But
why would we want to do a thing like that at a time like this?
The air has been so full of untruths, you know. What we need to do, and I really like that. I think that ought to be built into the ethos of elected officials, that they should try their best to tell the truth, which is not always advantageous to their chances of election or re-election. But our democracy will not evolve unless we have more truth telling. And these days, of course, we have to undo a lot of the other kind of telling, untruths that are everywhere. And I'm not necessarily taking a side here. I mean, the most egregious example is on one side, of course. But I think on both sides of the political divide, you have this going on, the tendency to politicize issues rather than to try to speak to the heart of the matter and to tell the truth as one knows it.
But I think that comes to our question about precision. You know, if we're going to tell the truth, you know, we can just move into how we interact with each other. If we're going to tell the truth, at least it would seem, demands some precision. You know, to say what is, you have to be somewhat precise, I would think. Okay, so I'm wondering about our ability. You know, we can get to our desire to do that, and that's, of course, important. But I'm even questioning our ability to be precise, to say what it means. You were talking earlier about cliches. And I think we use cliches because we are lacking in the ability to express what we really think, not just from the speaker's point of view or the writer's point of view, but from the receiver's point of view as well. For example, I have this problem often when I sit there, I write a column, for a newspaper. And when I sit down to write the column, I know what I want to say and I write it out, but then I have to go back and edit it for sixth grade education because a lot of my readers don't read past that, right? So yeah, I know exactly the words that are precisely what I want to say, but if nobody else knows those words, they're useless in that context. So I have to use some other word that they may know, but it really doesn't express what I'm trying to say. It doesn't have the nuance. It doesn't have the history, and it lacks depth at the very least. Sometimes I just can't write that thing because that idea doesn't. Those words don't exist because the idea for people doesn't exist. So they've never had a reason to know that word. And so, but if I introduce that word, I can be pretty sure that they're not going to go look it up in the dictionary, and that's the only way they're going to find out. And then you'd have to know kind of like the history of what that idea was about. So that gets to me, that gets to the problem of precision and language. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think it's important to use words which aren't familiar necessarily to your readers and define them. Define your terms. Etymology is extremely instructive. If you can accomplish that, demonstrate the importance of it, moving from the abstract to the concrete, explaining what you mean, then you're engaging the reader or the listener. And so I think you can usually quite briefly define your terms. Or I think you create a context for understanding unfamiliar words by context, by surrounding them with words that are familiar. You ought to give over to the idea that you have to speak simply in order to be misunderstood. I think you have an obligation as a speaker and as a writer to increase the vocabularies of your readers where necessary in order to enable them to better understand. My kids have always teased me about the words they heard using up, growing up. And I think, quite a bit of that for me was calculated. I wanted to increase their vocabularies. They have words and phrases to tease me about, but yet I think they haven't forgotten those words and phrases. And so in speaking to them, I wasn't trying to use highfalutin language. I wasn't trying to talk like an English professor. I was trying to demonstrate the importance of being more articulate. And I did that with my students as well, to the greatest extent possible. Now, there's a difference, of course, between doing that and speaking pretentiously and with some kind of self-importance built in. But I'm simply talking about practicing what you preach, expressing yourself in ways that might not necessarily be familiar, but will be familiar for your listeners. So, yeah, I think there's much to be said about you assuming some responsibility as a writer to increase the vocabularies of your readers. Don't dumb it down. Help them understand. Give them more words to use as resources. Help them become more articulate.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm in favor of that. I find myself as a minority, but I agree with you that is a way forward. It's when you have a word limit and you have a complicated subject, that's not always, let's say it's not easy to do if it's possible. But certainly it's important. I think it's important to if you're going to expand people's ideas, to me, it becomes inevitable that you expand their vocabulary, because there are just some ideas in which if you don't have that word, you can't express that. But then that comes to like other people, the listener's experience, because words don't have meaning unless unless you have an agreement on the meanings. They're just symbols. And so if I have an idea of one word and you have another, then that word is not useful to us until we can agree on the meaning. So some people don't have certain life experiences that they can get anything other than, let's say, a cursory dictionary idea of what the meaning is, but there is no experience that goes with that.
Well, in that case, I recommend the vicarious experience of reading.
Mm-hmm.
Dickinson said, there's no forget like a book.
Yeah.
And so, reading well-written text is experiencing that which you won't have an opportunity to physically experience yourself. And so I think that's, in fact, I used to tell my students the best way to increase your vocabulary, to increase your understanding of the importance of finding the right words. Read good writing.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting approach. I'm often confronted with something like trying to explain the taste of ice cream to someone who's never seen an ice cream cone. And to me, I could read that all day and still not know what ice cream tastes like. Because you have to have at least some baseline. And so when I translate that into certain life experiences, I can remember, for example, my first time walking around Akihabara, which is a fish market in near Tokyo, and all of the sights and sounds and smells and atmosphere there. I was trying to write about it. And I could write about it in words that I understood from that experience, but I really felt incapacitated to translate that to someone who had never experienced that. So when I translate that to, let's say, life experiences, trying to explain, for example, to a cop what it feels like to be always afraid that every cop you meet is potentially going to kill you, no matter how valid or invalid you think that is, walking around with that feeling, trying to explain that to someone, or explain to someone why you don't trust cops when in their experience, the cop was the guy who came and got your kid's cat out of the tree. But you never had the experience of the cop doing anything except humiliating or beating up the people that you knew. You never had an experience where the cop was nice to you. It's pretty hard to have a conversation with somebody and explain that to them.
Well, first of all, language is imperfect. You can't say exactly what you mean. Scott Momaday has a poem called Angle of Peace, in which he tries to express the loss someone else feels, the death of a child. And he says, more than language means. You can only go so far trying to express what you mean, what you feel. And finally, it's not altogether expressible. On the other hand, you can come close. And it's all about trying to be more expressive. And I circle back to what I said about reading. Alexander Pope said, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. You can find everywhere in literature things that say what you mean or come pretty close to saying what you mean, because writers are so articulate. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't give up on the idea of saying more about how you feel, because I think there are a lot of extremely moving texts authored by Black men who have had the experience you're talking about. That, of course, I cannot altogether understand and never completely understand how that feels, but their writings bring me closer. You really cannot completely share another's pain. You can't use those cliche cards which assume that you completely share the person's pain, because it's not possible. I've used to tell my students, but you can come closer than those cards do. I used to tell my students that the best cards of any kind are the blank ones.
Which one?
The blank cards, just, a nice image on the front and then flip it over, and you try to say how you feel and what you hope, whether it's congratulatory or a condolence. You're not using someone else's cliche assumptions about how you might feel. You're speaking authentically your deepest self. I smile when I get, I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings here, but I smile when I get cards, Christmas cards or whatever, where people just sign them. Well, okay, how do you feel? Give me something personal here.
Recently, like 2 or 3 years ago, recent in my terms, bought a book of words that express emotions. It was kind of like a dictionary of emotional terms. One, I was surprised that there were so many of them, and I was surprised at so many that I didn't know. And it occurred to me that we don't have much emotional vocabulary, compared to other things that we talk about. I mean, the words are out there, but it doesn't seem that we use them. And so, do you have any thoughts about our ability or inability to express emotions?
Well, it's difficult, obviously, but I think that one can do it through analogy. The poem I just mentioned, Angle of Geese, is about the death of a goose. The poet observes a goose shot out of a formation and coming to earth, and he goes to where the wounded bird is dying, cradles it, and says something about the bird watching the V go away, disappear into the distance. And he's really talking about the death of a child. The kind of feeling that ultimately isn't completely expressible, but can be understood to some extent through analogy, through comparison. And so I think that's one thing to think about.
So that gets
and also quite obviously avoid cliche, avoid what everybody always says in these circumstances. Try to speak more meaningfully out of your heart, how you feel. But I agree with you. I think that we need to increase our emotional vocabulary. And I think that Americans, especially men, are conditioned not to. And I see some trends in the other direction, and I like that. But I still think that we have been historically and even contemporarily inclined to undervalue words. Actions speak louder than words, we say. There's that playground chant, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never harm me. Well, that's the most fallacious statement I can imagine. Because, of course, words are extremely harmful, injurious, can be permanently injurious. But we're too inclined, I think, to think that in actions, it's important to, walk the walk as you talk the talk, of course. But I think we tend to denigrate language and in the process elevate disproportionately action.
One other question before I kind of throw it open to our other esteemed panelists. Is it possible to be too precise? And I will kind of frame that with this. In Japanese, it is considered almost impolite to be precise. It sounds, and in the language, it sounds very harsh. It sounds, when you are precise, which is my inclination. And so I learned the hard way to be what we say call in Japanese aimai, which is like vague and a bit obscure. There are lots of words in Japanese that have many, many, many meanings. That's one of the hallmarks to me of Japanese, is having one word mean so many things, often contradictory. But there seems to be a cultural thing about being imprecise, even down to the grammar of the language, where, for example, in Japanese, there is no formal future tense in the language. You can't say, I will do something in Japanese. There's no grammatical form for that. You can say, I intend to do that, but you can't say, I will do that. Everything is very vague. So it makes me wonder if there isn't some of that in English or in any language, where is there a point in which the individual feels that precision is ill-advised or just feels too constrained? Have you found that complaint in your experience as a teacher and as a practitioner of English?
Well, I taught technical communication for many years at SDSU, and because it was technical communication, engineering majors, I had a lot of students from other countries in those classes. I cautioned all the students that you have to be sensitive to philosophies of language of other cultures. If you're writing in English to Americans, for instance, you can make certain assumptions about how to proceed, but you have to understand that other cultures have other ideas about what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of the use of words. I think an example of that, for instance, is, I mentioned earlier, traditional tribal philosophies of language. Sometimes it's the case where someone will ask maybe a tribal elder a question, and he or she will respond with stories. And so the listener I've had this experience so many times, it's interesting to observe. The listener is frustrated because he or she is thinking, get to the point. Well, the point, so-called, is in the stories, and it's richly embedded in the story.
Mhm.
So you have to listen with a whole heart,
Mhm.
with a whole mind,
Mhm.
and that your question is being answered.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, that's true of other cultures. I told them that they especially would need to be attuned to the changing world and globalization and so forth. And they ought to not to go into that world with this me first idea, speak English or else kind of thing, but to be sensitive to other people's ideas of language and also to be open to the possibility of learning from them.
Mm.
I learned a lot more from native storytellers about some things than I ever learned about people who presume to speak more precisely about them.
Mm. 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 Mhm. Yeah. I want to open it up now to our other panelists, our other guests and co-conspirators. Any thoughts that you have on the precision of language? What do you feel about precision? Is that an important thing? Do you have experiences with it? Comments, questions? Oh, by the way, I think we have a new victim, Crystal.
Hello.
Can you tell us something about yourself, Crystal? I think the other people here know each other, but I think this is your first time with us, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was on last week, but I didn't get on the Zoom part of it, but I was listening in.
Oh, okay. Can you tell us something about yourself?
Okay.
Looking at your eyes, I know that you're wild, but
I'm enrolled in Assistant Wapton Oyate. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mhm.
I'm an assistant Wapton Oyate. Right now I'm at work, so I just trying to keep my mask on because my boss keeps looking by when he goes by. But I am the community planner for my tribe. I've worked with the tribe for over 35, almost 40 years now, like in different capacities. But I really like this topic. And so before it started today, I had to look up I don't use dictionary anymore, but I use Google. So I Googled precise language because I was like, I wonder what do they mean by precise language? What is going on here? So I Googled precise language and I was like, oh, that's what it is. That's just speaking. So telling your story, speaking your mind. So I have some things that I took away from this conversation today. I just wanted to share. When we talk about traditionals like elders, so the Dakota language, okay, so there's in South Dakota, we have Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. So not everybody Native American is Lakota, but it goes by like for our language, how in the way we sound on our language. So we have the D dialect, the Lakotas have the L dialect, and the Nakotas have the N dialect. So when I think about this being precise, this pandemic has been really crazy. And I usually do a lot of public speaking and presentations and facilitations and things like that. So I haven't been out there much. And I haven't been, I think I've been on a couple of Zooms, but that's about it. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to be at a tribal council meeting with some other individuals, program managers. And I also am the chairman of our Enemy Swim district. So I had a chance to speak on a few things about money and different things about our people and what they need. And so I was very precise. I try to always be precise in my words. And one of the things that I think is helpful is if you just make that your head and that heart connection, that those words, if you truly know what you're speaking about, those words are going to come. Sometimes I've gave my greatest presentations or speeches, and I don't even remember what I said. That's, that's when you hit it. And people are like, whoa, wow, that really touched me. That really made me think about things. And how people take us when we're speaking with them, the expectations, my expectations are different, than each and every one of you. None of us have the same expectations of one another. So in the Dakota language, one word can mean so many different things. It's not, our language is very descriptive. And so it's important that, when in the English language, it's, one word means maybe one thing, not maybe more than two or three, but in the Dakota language, the words are very descriptive when they speak. And also, so we have to keep that in mind, like when I listen to our elders, we had a few years back, we had some people come and they were sharing some information with our elders, and they were non-Indian, and they came from the city. And so what they said was, okay, the room was filled with elders, and they came in there and they said, okay, we want you to answer these questions, but you only got 5 minutes. Can you imagine that? One of the elders got up and he started speaking, and sometimes our elders go way back. They're like start from, just like from childhood. And then Charles said, when they want to explain something, they go way back, and then finally you got to really listen, because then you're going to hear that message, even though you might get impatient. So I think that part of being patient, and I've seen it when we've gone to testify, like at the peer, and that's really a tough one. And I have to tell people from my tribe, okay, we're going in there and we got 5 minutes. We got to say what we want to say quickly. They don't care that the Black Hills are not for sale. We got to just like go and say only the topic that we speak on, because their minds turn out quickly. So that's another thing that we have, precision language. I think we have to really like watch our audience, and like you said, know your audience. And if you have, like I was listening to you talk about, you have big words that you want to say, but you're afraid that nobody else would know, or you can't, explain in writing what they actually mean, what you want to say. I agree that you do have to go, you have to know your audience, and maybe you need to get a different audience, and maybe, go, whatever you love to do, that's up to you. But, my mom tells me that too. She'll be like, look, Lee, if you go to that meeting, Crystal, or a job interview, she's told me over the years, don't say too much. If they ask you, she said, they don't like people, Dakotas, they don't like people who talk up. Just be quiet and just nod your head every now and then. So that's kind of crazy how if you speak up too much, and if like in Dakota country, you think, you're smart, man, you know it all, whatever, you come over here and you start talking all big words and all that, people are going to be like, hey, who is this guy? So they'll get shut off right away. So that's just another thing about precise speaking in different cultures. When you go into maybe another reservation, if you're doing work, just be who you are, be calm, and speak on what you know, and just speak from your heart. I think that's very important. Like when we talk about precision speaking, is that we just say what you have to say. And if some people don't understand it, well then that's not you. That's on them. That's kind of what I think. And just, I had to say yesterday, I'm sorry if I offend anyone. I don't mean to offend. Sometimes the truth hurts. Mm-hmm. So we have to just, and my truth might be different from yours, so that's another thing that we have to really think about. It's important to set the stage when we're doing the speaking. Again, it's important to understand that we all have different expectations. And again, people only hear what they want to hear, right? They only hear what they want to hear. So I picked some of these things up from just listening. When I do presentations, it's listening, plus giving them something to see, give them something written, and then also what your words, maybe put something on the screen. So all three of these things will help them to remember what they're hearing. So I think that's important. And also and you already addressed it, to say what we mean and mean what we say. That's really important too. I mean, like this mask, I'm like an advocate for mask, and Betty knows that. We're like, wear your mask, wear your mask. We got a Facebook page and all that. So that's one thing. If I'm going to be an advocate and I want to be precise about my message, then yeah, I have to put this mask on. If somebody sees me out in public, they don't have my mask on, then it's going to cause a war, and it might even cause somebody else to just rip their mask off too. So precision speaking is, I didn't really, like I said in the beginning, I didn't really think about it, but this conversation is really, it helped me to think about some things today. So I really want to thank all of you, and I really appreciate that, I need these things, man. It's been a long 10 months, right, for all of us. So I really enjoy seeing all these new faces, and I enjoy seeing Betty, and we've done some, Lawrence, we've done some work together. I interviewed Lawrence on a tribal radio station a few years back, and really, there's so many things to talk about, and I think especially now during this pandemic that, maybe sometimes precision is good, but at times like this, any kind of conversation. So thank you.
But thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back and drag some other people with you, because we can always use some other insight, other points of view and input. We just really appreciate that. Anyway,
Lawrence,
yes.
I'd like to pose a question to the group in our what the professor has called our sort of uncivil times. How do you think social media and electronic communications has influenced precise language?
Well, I'll tell you my own personal story with that is that I became acutely aware of people's inability to communicate. And I don't mean that just to say they don't want to. I have a feeling that they can't. And I take that not just from Facebook, but from YouTube, where people are not talking about politics. They're not talking about sensitive social things. They're supposedly doing a tutorial. And you listen to the tutorial, and if you didn't know how to do it, you'll really be confused after listening to it, because it's like, and even when they're showing a picture of it, they're saying a thing, but the picture doesn't jive with what they're showing. They leave out all kinds of things, and you just watch and listen. And I became more aware of my own shortcomings in communicating. So I learned a lot about how I was missing lots of things that wasn't clear at all. If I would say it that way, I had been saying it that way, but it wasn't clear. And I think the same for me, the same thing with Facebook. I became more aware of how I wasn't communicating by listening to how other people weren't communicating, and realized, I do that too. So I shouldn't do that. I need to work that out. I need to be more clear in this area. I need to be more precise, because that way that's where I start to be concerned about it. I could just ask people. I could see that people didn't understand something that I said, and they would go off on the thing. And then I go back and read my post and realize, I wasn't as clear on that as I could have been. I should have used this word instead of that word. So I find that social media, it was kind of like a test where the kind of test you take to figure out how you're going to get better. Anyone else?
Lawrence, I'm reminded, speaking to the question of social media, of a book I mentioned to you when we were talking before the program started. And that's Housemaid of Dawn by Scott Momaday, which for me was a turning point book in many ways. One of the most important I've read. It's had enormous effect on my philosophies of language and life. But here's a passage, and I'll read it quickly, but I think it'll speak to to some extent what Barbara just said. A character is speaking in this novel. He says, my grandmother was a storyteller. She knew her way around words. She never learned to read and write, but somehow she knew the good of reading and writing. She had learned to listen and delight. She had learned that in words and in language and there only, she could have whole and consummate being. And so he goes on to talk about that traditional tribal philosophy of language. And then he says, in the white man's world, language too, and the way in which the white man thinks of it is undergone a process of change. The white man takes such things as words and literatures for granted, as indeed he must, for nothing in this world is so commonplace. On every side of him, there are words by the millions, an unending succession of pamphlets and papers, letters and books, bills and bulletins, commentaries and conversations. He has diluted and multiplied the word, and words have begun to close in upon him. He is sated and insensitive. His regard for language, for the word itself, by the way, word capital W, because that's a biblical allusion. In the beginning was the word singular, which I used to emphasize to my students. Think of words singular, not word singular, not words, as one of Shakespeare's characters says. He is sated and insensitive. His regard for language, for the word itself, as an instrument of creation, has diminished nearly to the point of no return. It may be he will perish by the word. But it was not always so with him, and it is not so with you. Consider for a moment that old Kiowa woman, my grandmother, whose use of language was confined to speech, and be assured that her regard for words was always keen and proportionate, in proportion as she depended upon them. You see, her words were medicine. They were magic and invisible. They came from nothing into sound and meaning. They were beyond price. They could neither be bought nor sold. And she never threw words away. There's that idea of words as actions. You know, we tend to think of words as merely as descriptions of actions. Words themselves are actions. If you speak well, you're making something happen. It is a happening, and especially articulate statement. And, you know, this book was written, published in 68 or 69. What might we make of these ideas now? Because we have additionally or further diminished the impact of words through multiplication pretty dramatically.
Anyone else?
If I can say just a few words, Charles, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you, Chris.
Oh, hi, Charles, and hi, crew. Hi, Jennifer, Ryan, Lawrence, and Betty, and Lee, and the rest of the crew. Crystal, nice to meet you. It's been Barbara. Thanks for your
Jace,
question.
excuse me, Jace.
Yeah, it's Jace talking.
I
And
thought it
Jace
was-
doesn't have her teeth in, so Jace
I thought
does
it
not
was
going to put her
Crystal.
picture on. I know. If you put my picture on, Crystal and I look quite a bit alike, actually, on the Zoom. Except I'm older, Crystal. I'm really happy to hear Charles again, and Ryan knows I'm a fan of his dad. He's such a wonderful speaker, wonderful teacher, and also a wonderful person who uses good language. And I love language, and I love language in all cultures and all spoken word. And I was just thinking about the elders, and Crystal mentioned that as well. You know, I get a kick out of, and I always spend time with elders talking to them, because you learn so much, and not because they give you an answer right away, but they lead you to other places that the spoken word does. It leads you to learn about other things that you might not even have considered wanting to go to or wanting to explore. And I really appreciate the fact that when you teach, as Charles has done for many years, when you encourage your students to explore and to learn about new things and new cultures and new people, you know, ways of life, that's how we learn how to better communicate and better appreciate other human beings. We become better human beings by that experience, by those experiences. And when I was thinking about talk, it is kind of frustrating though to talk to us elders because we don't give you an answer right away. It takes us a while to get to what we want to share with you. And that's okay, I think, but it is time consuming sometimes, but you know, learning is timely. You know, it takes time to learn things. So we do have to be more patient. I also appreciate the language because my mother was a first language speaker. She spoke Lakota as her first language in the home. But when she went to college, her major was English. And the reason why she picked English was because so she'd have a better understanding of Washitu people, of non-natives, because that's how they communicate in English. And she wanted to be able to communicate in a better way with the non-native culture. And so what better way than to take a major in their language, how they talk to one another. And so she was very, very kind of critical of our English when we were growing up. If we would say slang, Lakota slang, everybody knows what "enet" means. Isn't that right? Enet. But my mom used to get so angry at us and we used to dig her on it. We'd say, "Enet, Mom, don't use that. There's no such word as enet. Isn't that right?" So I used to get really upset with us. And so we just loved to tease her about using wrong English and using slang. But bringing up Scott Momaday, what a wonderful, eloquent speaker and writer. His work, Housemaid of Dawn, and others were required reading for us as we're as new collegiate students going to school. We had to read Scott Momaday because he was the person that could talk to who we were, who we are as a people, and we got it, we get it. And so that I enjoy listening to that again. And I also enjoyed listening to, there's a video on Scott's life and how he talks about his connection to the earth and sacred places and all that. And his daughter produced it. And that's exciting too, to hear him, see him and hear him talk about how the language has helped him and how the land has shaped how he feels about the world and the people in it. And I better shut up. I'm talking too much. Sorry, folks.
Well, I would really appreciate your input. I think Lee had something that she wanted to say.
I always do. Number one, thank you very much. Charles, what was your last name?
Woodard,
Woodard.
And I didn't get, where were you a professor?
South Dakota State.
Well, that's okay. You couldn't get into the U. No, I always
You forgive me?
say, I am very impressed and delighted to be part of this group. I do not know why I joined, but now I do. I loved the thinking, the intellect, the varied experiences. I have learned so much. And as far as how to communicate, I have many thoughts about it, but one of it was really great that you brought, see, I'm probably using the wrong words, appreciative of this, that you brought up the words and focused so succinctly on that. When I hear people now, I have heard things like your actions and your manner of speaking, they watch that and not listen to the words as much anymore, whether it's something quick or wanting to make quick judgments or whatever it might be. But it's so neat to see that we have gotten to the root of languages. And one more story. Somebody in another state was a salesperson, and he had the new job and he was to be traveling all over the world and did not realize the importance of knowing other cultures. And I think he was from John Deere and had a green cap on. And the green cap, if you wore it in this country, it meant your wife was a prostitute. Needless to say, you need to know about other cultures.
And there are other ways to communicate beside words. Well, we're kind of running out of time. We ran out of time, but I want to thank everybody for joining us. This is a kind of conversation that really could go a while, because there are lots of things that I had in mind to cover, but they're just not the time to do it. Next week, we're going to have a special guest, Jennifer Quayle. And Jennifer Quayle, she works with the Brookings Economic Development, but we're going to be talking about the makerspace. Now, why would we talk about the makerspace in this space? Because creativity is a critical part of our human connection. And the makerspace provides not only the space for it in terms of the physical space and the equipment, but more important, it creates a social space for creatives. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the creative process and the creative experience, and also the importance of having a creative community and what's involved with that. So I hope that you'll all join us next week for a very interesting and I hope exciting conversation. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you all. So wonderful, Dr. Woodard. It was just wonderful to hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Charles. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.